Sarah and Chandrea, this is Max. Feel free to let me know when you'd like me to give the pre-meeting little speech, and I will be happy to do that.
Okay. I guess give it
Sure.
another minute and one of us will welcome. And then, yeah. All right, I guess we can get started. Uh, welcome everyone to the Social Justice Committee meeting of Community Board 8. We appreciate having you all here, as well as our presenters, and Max is going to give you a little instructions if need be. Take it away.
Thank you, Sandra. So welcome. If this is your first time joining us, everyone will remain muted throughout the meeting except committee co-chairs Sandrea and Sarah, and presenters. Following the presentation, co-chairs will call on members of the public that wish to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions icon and pressing raise hand, not the wave or thumbs up button. Only press it once, because if you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Please be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm muting once the co-chairs call on you. Please note the chat is for technical support only to help with Zoom software problems and not to ask questions of the co-chairs. If you have an older version of Zoom, you'll need to go to the participants section at the bottom of the screen and you'll find the raise hand feature there. And finally, please do not raise your actual hand or wave at us because we may not be able to see you. And now go ahead, Sandrea and Sarah.
Okay. Great. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at the May 24th, 2021 meeting of the Social Justice Committee. I am so excited, and Sandrea and I are so excited to welcome our guest tonight. You have the opportunity to hear from some of the trailblazers on issues of surveillance technology. And so tonight we'll be hearing from Mutale Nkonde. Mutale, did I get your last name? Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay, I got the thumbs up, yay. She's the CEO for AI for the People. Meg Young, Dr. Meg Young, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech. So one of the initiatives that has been really important to the Upper East Side and CB Communities 8. And of course, Philip Ellison, who is from the Public Advocate's Office. He's also a researcher at the Digital Life Initiative. And in addition to being the Manhattan Borough Advocate, he's also the liaison to the Technology Data and Development Group. And so they'll be giving us a presentation on issues regarding kind of the intersection of social life, justice, and technology as they're being implemented in New York City and in our lives. And now I don't know which of you needs access, but Max, I think that our guests need access so they can share their.
I was just speaking with one of them actually, and that was,
Great. So I will now, and so for those of you who are just joining us for the first time or who are old hands at this community meeting, after we hear from our presenters, we'll have our community discussion. And then at that point, we can think about in addition to responding to and thinking about how the work that we're going to hear about today connects to our lives and to our community, we can also consider resolutions that we would like to send to the full board that touch on what we're hearing today. So I will turn it over to our guests.
Sure. Let's see. So who am I unmuting first? Philip?
Yes. Oh. I'm here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, Will. Good to see you. Good to see you, CB8. And first, I'd like to start by giving thanks and a shout out to Sarah Chu as well as Sondrea. Sarah is obviously an advocate and a fighter for justice and equity, both on this board, but in her real-time work. And I've had a number of conversations with her. And so I'm very thankful for her leadership and for this community boards group to come together and what we like to say in the office, particularly on a learning process, a conversation. I think oftentimes when it comes to technology, people, all different types of people kind of steer away from that conversation. It can be complicated. And what our office is doing by working with Meg and of course Mutale and our larger work in the city around technology, data, and surveillance is really to say, let's learn together. Because if we don't do it now, it might be, some could argue that it's a little bit late, but we're all coming to the table in our office and learning, and the public advocate himself has done a lot of learning. So I just wanted to start and ground us in with that. I'll also make introductions and share bios before, but a little bit of give you a kind of a timeline and snapshot of what we'll be talking about this evening. I'll ground us a little bit more about why our office has been looking into and what kind of work we've been doing around facial recognition, reimagining policing and tech and race. We see all these things intersecting, and why is that and why that's important. After I give the bios for both Meg and Mutale, we'll show the Ban the Scan short film. It's about a 5-minute film. And then Mutale can go and talk about a bit about what goes into the development of these technologies, these digital surveillance tools like facial recognition, so you can understand some of the foundations of why this happens, what these outcomes that we see. And we'll also talk about the relationship between local government or government and tech, private sector vendors, right? Whether that's big tech or smaller companies. And we'll talk a little bit about the scale and different surveillance tools that we're seeing in modern day policing and housing. And we'll also walk through kind of the landscape and pushback of what's going on in the country. New York City's not first to this issue. There's actually a movement in the country around this. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then lead into actually like a small case study. Meg spent some time in Seattle doing some really interesting work and research with local government, private sector vendors, and communities. And so Meg can talk about that, and she'll walk through something she created called the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit. And then we'll end on what's the state of New York State, New York City when it comes to facial recognition and surveillance. So I just wanted to walk you through what you can expect. Of course, we'll do Q&A, and if there's some burning questions, we really, again, look at it as a learning opportunity, and so thankful to be here. So I begin to kind of have us think about when we are looking back and what took place this last summer. And, we are really at the anniversary tomorrow in the death of George Floyd, right? This next iteration in the Black Lives Matters movement, in the civil rights movement, really seeing a lot of change, whether in policing or in the awareness of in some of the, anti-Blackness and or just the what we've seen throughout different parts of our history, right? That we're actually coming to terms and reconciling. And I think this community board and this particular committee is representative of that. I know as a Manhattan Borough advocate, good other community boards in Manhattan and other places have created social justice committees, or organizations have created, social justice teams and so forth to reconcile and figure out how do we just come to that. And so when we think about George Floyd's death, we also know that there was movements across the country that were calling for justice, that were calling for a review of laws, and calling for looking and interpreting around modern day policing and inequities that we see either in culture or in government. And when those kind of movements were taking place, they were really key to what kind of progress we've made thus far. But what was also happening? What was the undertone that was taking place in the city and in parts of the country? What we've come to understand is that, right, that the police department, NYPD, which again, this goes beyond just policing, but we use a little entry point of surveillance around modern day policing, was leveraging surveillance tools, technology tools that are essentially a suite of different technologies coming together under private sector, companies that sell software to police departments, sheriff departments. And what we saw in New York City is essentially that protesters, people who were exercising their civil rights, the right to protest, to assemble, to play a role in our moving our society and culture forward, were getting surveilled by police, right? They were using facial recognition to try to identify and find people who were doing this kind of really citizen work, is what I like to say, right? The work of citizenship in the United States. And so what we come to understand is so that our office released a platform around reimagined public safety. The public advocate, Jumaane Williams, is a former housing activist, a reformer in the city council around stop and frisk and ban the box, right? But he also says we need to work with police, while we need to hold the transparency, accountability, and we need to reimagine through a platform what are different ways that we can essentially move policing in the community forward, right? And through that lens, we've also recognized that, and I'll end here and then about the next 2 minutes, around how technology, which people oftentimes view as a science, right? They trust in technology. Our TVs work, our computers, our internet. We don't know what's going on behind the box, but it's having an outcome that we're using. Is that technology actually is biased? For the development process leads to bias. Like there are racist or outcomes that affect the low-income people and people of color and impact Black people. And so we realize that when we have the intersection of surveillance and policing, we're seeing things in housing, we're seeing different parts of government and this impact of race, we needed to take a look, right? We're advocating for the public. We're thinking about transparency. We're thinking about local government accountability. And lastly, I would say this, I would like us to think about this. I think, if we were in a room, I would ask you to raise your hand. And why would I ask you to raise your hand? I would ask, who might have thought or agreed that technology is the infrastructure for how we operate after coming out of this pandemic. When we think about the pandemic, it's about people, but the infrastructure for our finance, for our receiving our benefits, doing business, our social media, our communication is essentially technology, right? And so that is partly why we're here today too, is that recognizing that technology is playing such a fundamental role, we have to take a look about how local government, how policing, how our society is using these tools. So I end there, and I thank you for kind of listening to why the public advocate, Jumaane Williams, why myself, why the tech director, John Catt, and our former deputy public advocate of justice, health, equity, and safety really had put technology and these themes really front and center as one of the issues that we've been tackling and wanting to come to the community to have really critical conversations and learning. So without further ado, I just would like to, before we show the 5-minute film, I just would like to talk about the people who I admire, that I collaborate with, that I learn from. So I start with Mutale Nkonde, who I've had the chance to get to know and work in many different capacities. And so Mutale is the founder of AI for the People. AI for the People is a communications firm whose mission is to add racial justice to all discussions about tech. Prior to starting AI for the People, Nikande worked in AI governance, right? Artificial intelligence. I want to make sure that when we use lingo, we want to break it down to layman's terms, right? In this learning capacity, artificial intelligence is AI. During that time, she was part of the team that introduced the Algorithmic Accountability Act, the Deepfakes Accountability Act, and the No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act to the US House of Representatives, which we'll talk a little bit about as well during this talk. During 2020, Nikande led the analysis of 1.3 million tweets shared by a Black disinformation network operating during the 2020 US presidential election. The findings were published in the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review. And she is continuing this work at the SAFE Lab at Columbia University. In 2021, AI for the People recently co-produced a film with Amnesty International to describe how technical systems we use in everyday lives became encoded with racial bias, and how she will be featured. She was and is featured as an expert on race and tech in Debunking Borat, a 6-part docuseries that starts streaming on Amazon Prime tomorrow. And Mutale is a wealth of knowledge, networks, and she was leading this fight along with some others in our country and around the world earlier, before this is beginning to take focus. Right, this was on 60 Minutes recently. Last week, facial recognition was on 60 Minutes. City and State, the New York Times. We're seeing many different things in our backyard, and so that I just want to put that in context, right? And thank Mutale for her leadership. Also, like to thank Meg for her leadership and give you a quick bio about Meg, so you know who you're in conversation and learning from. Meg is a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative. Her work applies to ethnographic and design methods to understand the government use of information technologies on the ground, with a focus on how to make proprietary systems more accountable to the public. I'm in glee over hearing the sounds of motorcycles and people outside, so I apologize. But that's a beautiful thing given the COVID dynamic we've been in. Her current project examines her past projects has covered government procurement of automated decision systems. Meg's work to date reports on field work with public agencies, advocates, activists on data governance, surveillance, privacy, open records, data ownership, public-private partnerships, public engagement, and data trust. She's been published in the ASEM FACCT, Big Data and Society, CHI, Ethics and Information Technology, and the Berkeley Technology and Law Journal. And she's a co-founder of the Critical Platform Studies Group, a nonprofit that partners with civil rights groups to pursue algorithmic accountability through participatory design. She was also a researcher at University of Cambridge and got her undergrad and master's at the University of Michigan and her PhD at the University of Washington. So with that said, I just wanted to take a moment. I think it's important to know who's giving expertise or who's in discussion. So I'd love just to pass it over to Mutale to take a moment to just preface the film and show you all the Ban the Scan film.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hi. Good evening, everybody. My name's Mutale Nkande. I always get shocked when those bios are read, because when you're working, you're just working, but I am definitely living proof that Black girls code. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to show the film, and then just take you through kind of how the technology was developed and what it means for real people in real life. And then I'm really interested in any questions or leading us into discussion. Okay. So before I got into technology, I was actually a filmmaker. And one of the reasons that AI for the People stayed in communications and uses film is that it just reaches more people. So we were recently on CNN speaking about this work, and we found that in the time slot, we beat the demo. So more people watched us than MSNBC. We want lots of people to understand this, and that's one of the reasons that we use art and culture as ways to communicate.
When the building was bought by new management, they switched security companies and they just like switched the whole thing around. There's a big screen TV broken up maybe into like 12 or more smaller screens that are constantly switching floors. And then like to see like people tap their key fob and then the screen pops up, it's just like, whoa.
We had to think about this problem in a nuanced form and not think about it as a new technology coming to our building, but think about it from the framework of this is a new pest within the already ongoing onslaught of strategies that landlords use to harass their tenants.
When I first answered the door, I thought the man had kind of looked familiar, and I cracked the door. Warrant for the arrest. I immediately slammed the door closed, and I told him to slide the warrant under my door.
We received this really thick manila packet, probably had like 30-something pages in it. And it had a one-pager about the type of technology that they would be using, which was Stone Lock's facial recognition heat mapping system, which they tried to sell as being like a better alternative to other facial recognition systems. But to get into the building, I would need to scan my face.
And that was my first time where I had a real negative relationship with technology, because it was something I never asked for being imposed on me. And the things that it was going to potentially take was something I had a problem with. And I got worried for folks like my great grandmother, who doesn't know anything past your regular like rotary phone.
I'm raising a brown boy in New York City, in gentrified Brooklyn. It does not make me feel safe for my son. It does not make me feel good at all. I don't want his biometric data in some system from when he was 4 years old. Like my thought pattern was like, if this thing is installed into my building and you are now tracking my face, you have my biometric data now, and I go to work one day and I'm working 9 to 5, but while I'm at work, I end up in a virtual lineup that I don't know about. Nobody calls you, nobody tells you, they just do a virtual lineup. But now I have to fight the algorithms. I have to prove that the algorithm is wrong. I have to tell some data scientist that, yep, that algorithm is wrong. Like, that's not my face. That's not my biometrics.
I was looking out of my bedroom windows, and there was officers in my patio area, and one on my fire escape. One was holding his holster like this, and the other had a long gun, and they were pointed directly at me. And that escalated it quite a bit. Yeah. So this is where the police had a battering ram against my door. Inside, the walls were shaking, pictures were falling down. I could hear them counting loudly, saying 1, 2, 3, boom. There's evidence that they use facial recognition software to track me, and a lot of the details are pointing towards that. I know that they utilized my social media. They took pictures from my Instagram to make wanted posters and to post on their public Twitter.
All you're seeing is a nuanced tool on an age-old problem. Surveillance has always been a thing, particularly within Black and brown communities.
I don't think law enforcement has a history of de-escalating when it comes to Black bodies and Black men especially.
The algorithms aren't built to recognize us. Faces like ours are not put into the data sets. So they automatically have bias against us because they don't know us. So they see us as a threat.
The right thing to do sometimes is never easy, and you just got to accept that. And so I think that's what we've accepted here at Atlantic. It's difficult. It is. I wouldn't say this is hopeless.
So that's one piece of media that we created with Amnesty International for a campaign that they launched and is still ongoing with the Public Advocate's Office today, called Ban the Scan. So that's calling for a policy to ban these technologies, but you might be asking, why would we be looking for that ban? And it's simple. These technologies have real life implications to people's lives. So what you're seeing now is a picture of Najir Parks on the right. Najir Parks is an 32-year-old African-American man that lives in Woodbridge, New Jersey. He was misidentified using facial recognition, much like we heard in the film. And the image that he was misidentified by was this image on my left. So this is another African-American man who within this system had picked up Najir. Now, the way that these systems work is that they use a process called machine learning. And the learning part of machine learning is that they learn to match images in the case of computer vision, which drives facial recognition. And you do this by putting in, for the sake of our discussion, a million pictures into a data set. We heard Trinae talk about these data sets, right? These data sets are the means by which the system will learn. And what we found in research is that the majority of the pictures in the data sets that are being used by police have white men. And so when it comes to trying matching, because facial recognition systems work by having one picture, like this picture on my left that I'm circling, and then comparing it to the picture of somebody on their right. And if something comes up with a match, then that can be used in the investigative process to decide whether somebody has committed a crime. Now, there is a caveat. Most facial recognition manufacturers say that these pictures cannot be used for probable cause of arrest. But look what happened with Najir. So he's misidentified. The literature tells us that this misidentification is at the 40% rate. Now, scientifically, for a system to be sound, it should have a 1% misidentification rate. But in this case, that's 40%. So this really shouldn't be in the marketplace. Najir then spends 10 days in jail because he's wrongly identified. Why does he spend 10 days in jail? Because he is under a cash bail system, and Najir is a poor person living in America. So you get this conflation of cash jail that keeps the poor in jail if they can't make bail, and this misidentification of facial surveillance. And you end up with these types of situations that disrupt people's lives. He's now currently suing the police in Woodbridge, New Jersey. He's suing in New Jersey. There are 2 active cases in Detroit, Robert Williams and 2 others. And I believe I just heard that there's a 3rd case in Detroit also, where police are using these technologies. So how about our city? How about the NYPD? We know from the good old New York Post that the NYPD are using a technology called Clearview. So this idea that Black people could be mismatched using this technology is very real possibility for us. And we also know in upstate that these same technologies are being used. So it's not just our city, it's Rochester and other cities. And I'm going to stop share for just a second, because I know we're going to talk about this later, but this isn't the only technology that police are using in this way. And machine learning techniques like the ones that I described, where you have certain data sets to train the technology, and if that data set is not diverse, then it cannot do the job of matching everybody's faces. I always joke when I'm speaking to industry partners that they should really call this CHAD recognition and not facial recognition, because it does not have the technical ability to recognize Black faces, but it is being used in contexts like policing to do so. So I'm gonna come back a little bit and give my colleague Meg an opportunity to come in, but I look forward to coming back later in the discussion to talk about some of the other technologies that the New York City is going to be using as part of this Safe Streets plan that de Blasio announced 2 weeks ago.
Thank you so much for that, Mutale. I am very excited to be with all of you. And I just wanted to underline a few points that Mutale has raised that are extremely important for the purpose of this discussion. So I'm part of a larger technology policy and AI ethics research community. And that community includes computer scientists, sociologists, law professors, and there's a research consensus that is forming that there should be a ban on facial recognition technology for 2 reasons. And the first is that researchers who are evaluating existing technologies that are on the market are finding what Mutale just shared, which is how profoundly the technology underperforms on the faces of people of color, especially Black faces, especially Black women. And second, if for some reason the technology were to be developed in a way where it could become more accurate, you're looking at a society in which there's an erosion of practical obscurity in our everyday life. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where the tools that we're talking about are already widely available, not just to law enforcement, but to people who have private businesses or even people who have a phone on the train. Today, it is possible to take a photo of a stranger, to go to a Russian search engine, put that person's photo that you took in, and then to find their social media accounts. And essentially that is how Clearview AI, a very widely used facial recognition tool, works. So taking a step back from that, I just want to speak briefly to what we did in Seattle. We are sociologists, and we were embedded in this context where Seattle had something called a surveillance ordinance on the books since 2013. And the purpose of the law was to make sure that any of the surveillance technologies being used by the government were being disclosed to people so they at least understood what's being used. But in 2017, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and increasing awareness of how these surveillance systems specifically harm communities of color, there was an interesting event. Essentially, it came to light that the police department was using social media surveillance, a tool that was looking at residents' Facebook posts, and this was not being reported under the surveillance ordinance. So advocates raised the alarm, asked questions, why wasn't this being disclosed? And the answer was that it was software, it wasn't hardware, and it didn't fall under the jurisdiction of the ordinance. So that really raised concerns, and we saw this overhaul of the surveillance ordinance to try to recognize all the different ways these tools aren't just law enforcement technologies, but they could also be reappropriations of a transportation data collection, for example. And long story short, we ended up talking to a bunch of people in the city and advocates about the process of overhauling this law. And along the way, we learned that there are several AI technologies that were being used in Seattle, but no one was asking questions about bias and performance and accuracy of the nature that Mutale has shared with us. In fact, those kinds of questions don't only apply to facial recognition. Those same kinds of questions apply to an array of artificial intelligence tools and algorithmic systems. So there was this gap, honestly, between what we as researchers considered to be AI and what people in the city considered to be AI. We thought if you're doing automated license plate readers, that is AI, and we need to know how accurate are those systems. And people in the city thought AI is a very advanced state-of-the-art technology, and we only really need to be concerned once something approaches like the state-of-the-art cutting edge tech. And this gap led us to take up a project to try to think about how do we make this research consensus around algorithmic bias and harm more accessible to people that don't have a technical background. We ended up partnering with ACLU Washington, which had been doing a lot of work with a coalition of community civil rights groups who were concerned about this issue. And we created with them, through weeks of meetings and distilling the literature and bringing it back to advocates and trying to find some distilled crystallization of these questions, something that we're calling the Algorithmic Equity Toolkit. And I would just like to take a moment to share it with you so that this is a resource that you'll be able to consult if it is useful to you. It is essentially a group of one-pagers, and all it does is give you the resources to ask, for a given technology, is this AI or not? And you can use a flow chart to ask a series of questions about whether it's surveillance tech or AI, and make that definitional distinction. We give definitions that are intended for all non-specialists to be able to use to engage in this space. This fill in the blank is a way of trying to parse out what is the technology's intended use? What are ways that the tech could be misused? And then this final piece that for me is the most important is a questionnaire. So a community board like yours has a really important civic role to be able to advocate not only for CB8, but on behalf of the people in your district to ask your lawmakers questions in order to make sure that people's civil rights are being protected. And this questionnaire is supposed to be a list that distills all of these questions into something that you could bring into a meeting with your representative. And it has two parts. The first is to ask questions about, are these systems that are being used accurate? And policymakers should be able to show that there's been robust evaluation, not only in a lab, but in the field, that these technologies work for everyone, not just for some people. And the second part of this is to talk about ways that injustice can still be perpetuated when they work well. So if we lived in a society where facial recognition was widely used and everywhere we went, our faces were identifiable, what kinds of concerns would that raise about justice, or how does that intersect with historical patterns of racism or sexism? So I'm going to drop the link for this in the chat and hand it back over to Mutale, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this resource with you. And I'm really excited to hear your questions and talk with you further.
Okay, I'd actually like to step back and zoom out. I'll make it just a little bit conversational because I think there's a lot of information being shared, a lot of great information, but I'd kind of like two things. My goal in zooming out is to ask a couple questions of our panelists to dig a little bit deeper, right? To review a little bit of what was shared, right? And so for Mutale, we're going to go to two examples. What we did here, what was talked about was we used this hardcore example that even the Public Advocate's Office had come out, right? We joined the Ban the Scan Coalition with Amnesty International, along with Mutale and a number of other local data and tech or civil rights or immigrant rights groups, right? There's a coalition here that has called on this work. And when we did so, you heard Mutale mention Clearview AI. You heard Meg mention Clearview AI. What is that? So when the Public Advocates Office released, what we recognized and learned about was that the Staten Island. I want to bring this close. We heard about New Jersey. We'll talk a little bit about the country and different cities, but not just New Jersey across the river, where we have instances of misidentification and so forth, but in Staten Island, the district attorney was using, no one knew that the district attorney was using a vendor that they weren't supposed to be using that that essentially circumvents the rules, right? So Clearview AI is a tech company that scrapes, the language is scrapes, but essentially can use an algorithm or to go throughout the internet and takes people's pictures from social media and input them and run them through a system, right? It's a bunch of inputs. These pictures are inputs and you get outputs. And so they were using this tool that they were not supposed to be using, or no one knew that they were using in ways that were kind of against. And so who is ultimately, the public advocate, Jumaane Williams, said, hold on here, this is a problem, right? And so where's the accountability and the oversight for the district attorney in Staten Island? Right? Like, who is policing the police when it comes to using these tools? Where's the oversight and transparency? And so, that company, I even want to just highlight that company, Clearview AI, has been researched to have kind of like white supremacist libertarian leanings, political ideology aside, but more so that the founders, right, have been tied to this. And this is the tool, a company that is being sold to police departments and sheriff departments all across the country. And when we think about technology, we have to think about scale. Technology can scale. We've seen that with being on Zoom, that we can reach massive amounts of people. So when we think about these private sector companies, when I mentioned these founders, they were not thinking of including data sets or checking with communities. They were thinking, now I highlight and bring it back to the question here, is around the relationship between the private sector and government or police, right? Is that these companies that are these private vendors are just as important as the government that we're talking about, right? They are looking to what the startup ecosystem in the United States is oftentimes to move fast and break things. They're not thinking about, if they don't have people of color on their teams, on their boards, they're not thinking about some of these implications, right? And the community boards come out of a push to make the central local government of the mayor's office more accountable. And so we also see that like urban planning didn't include these voices or these implications. And so did the private sector shareholder model when it comes to selling software. And so I asked with all that, I just wanted to ground that when we think about it's a relationship between government and private sector. If you take a moment, we see Clearview AI, but for Mutale, could you talk a little bit about the relationship to big tech and what's the status on big tech? When we talk about big tech, the Amazons and the IBMs, what's the status and what has happened in the last 2 years around this issue?
So Clearview AI is just one vendor, probably one of the most famous vendors because they were so shameless about using our social media profile pictures to feed the data set. And the reason that they did that was to get around this issue of misidentification that I described. So one solution by technologists has been if there are too many white people, white men in the data set, it makes it harder to recognize people of color. And the reason that happens is the way the system learns is by pattern matching, right? So if when these pictures of white men are in the data set, they will take a note of the skin color and tag that. They will look at the circumference of the eyes, the width of the nose, the maybe, from the bottom lip to the chin. And all of these are culturally specific. People of Asian descent generally have a smaller eye circumference as white men, for example. One of the things that was found in Gender Shades, which was spoken about in the 60 Minutes piece, was that long hair was seen as a marker of womanhood and tagged as women. Short hair was tagged as men. Now, I'm a Black woman. I can go to the hairstylist, buy this, put it on my head and have long hair, and then I can take it off and have short hair. I am still a woman, but because this is a machine and this is not a human being, it's not going to be able to look at that nuance. So when we talk about Detroit, that was actually a different technology vendor. That was a vendor called Mark One, for example. So in terms of status, the way that I would answer the question is that police departments all over the country are using various different facial recognition vendors. Why do they use different vendors? It's because of the business model. Often these are given to governments on 30-day trials, so they're not necessarily paying for them, or it's for a really short period of time, or with Clearview, as an example, they'll market it directly to police officers. And so when we do FOIA requests to see what's being used, researchers like me don't know, because if you don't pay for something, it's not going to show up in government ledger. And the reason that that's really important is that tech companies want scale. They don't care about price. They want your eyes, your attention, your dependence on the product to then use your data to sell other things. That's how social media works. And so the reason that oversight becomes so important is that we have new business models that are pursuing scale and not necessarily procurement. We have technologies that are being built for and by a largely white populace, which means that they don't necessarily have design insights around the fact that, and in a given week, a Black woman could have braids, Afro puff, short hair, long hair, still be the same person and need to be identified as the same person if this is the way we're going forward. And then for my colleagues in the legal community, this is actually a violation of not just our privacy, but we're in New York City. We know the second district has already said that this warrantless search, this stopping and searching us, right, is unconstitutional. It is a violation of our Fourth Amendment right, which is the right not to have unsubstantiated search. And so while the indicators are bad, what is great is that we are recognizing this, we are resisting this. The resistance is being led mostly by Black women, whether it's myself, Joy Bilawami, Timnit Gebru, in Congress, Congresswoman Clark here in Brooklyn, where I sit. And that fight that is being led by the most impacted is also being supported by allies across the country.
No, thank you, Mutale. And I just for a moment here before I just talk about the legislation and state of the country, and then we open up for conversations and Q&A. But I wanted to see, there's two things here just to pick up. Meg, I'm going to ask you any additional thoughts around the relationship between private sector vendors and what you've seen and technology that's been used.
Thanks, Philip. I take it that your first question was about the state of legislation. So to answer that, I'll say that there is a push and you've probably heard about it, that there's a push to ban facial recognition, that in many places like Cambridge and Oakland, that they've banned it for government use. But in other cities like Portland, they've banned its use from the government and in the private sector. And then in other jurisdictions, the ACLU has led a push for a broader community control over police surveillance tools. So this model bill has been carried out in a number of cities across the US, and indeed Seattle was one expression of this work, but that seeks to not only disclose the technologies being used, but also to do different forms of assessment on whether the tools are having a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and to do surveillance impact reports. But it's important to note that that bill ends up creating a lot of documentation that then the public has to consume in the form of hundreds and hundreds of pages of reports. And so when we look across the country for what the right model is to move forward, there's a basic disconnect between this model that tries to do documentation and reporting in the name of transparency, and a model that says that no, if you look at the nature of these technologies, that they're too dangerous and the harm would be too great. So we either need to put a moratorium or we need to ban it outright.
Right. No. Yeah. And I add to Meg, right, that what we've seen is some states and cities you mentioned they've regulated the technology outright or outright banning its use, or they've included the ability for citizens to sue the government and private actors. As of January 2020, the state of California, to Meg's point, issued a 3-year moratorium on the use of technology and police body-worn cameras. Notably, the city council in San Francisco, Oakland, and Somerville is where I went to college, Medford, Somerville, Massachusetts voted unanimously to ban facial recognition in all capacities of city agencies or by city agencies, including the police department. Right. And so there's a number of bills. There's more than 29 bills of pending legislation around the country. And I think New York State has 20 bills or more. And it's not facial recognition or biometric technology surveillance, right, which can be the way you walk, right, gait, your face, your fingerprints, et cetera. There's a host of what can be recorded, right? Seeing, somehow someone's walking. And so you've seen this in Boston, you've seen this in where the backyard of Silicon Valley being banned. And so that tells you something where Boston with MIT and San Francisco with Stanford and Berkeley and all those, Caltech and all those great universities there where tech and innovation hubs, that's the response. So we have to hold and think about, consider, what does that mean, right? And or what's the gravitas, or what's the gravity of that? And I also want to note that this is not, yes, we think about Black people, of course, I want to ground too in history, right? Surveillance has existed here. Historically, you see Dr. Brown at UT Austin has written about, right, and noted how Black people and people of color in more colonial times in Manhattan and other parts of the country had to use a torch to go outside at night, right? And so when we think about surveilling Black bodies and communities that are over-policed, we have to connect the thread of this history to this modern context post 9/11. And so, Muslim database, most of the gang database, the Muslim surveillance post 9/11, and now this more modern form, right? There's a thread here. It's not just a disruption or this severed piece. There's historical evolution that we have to see when we think about race, policing, technology as well. And lastly, I'd say here too that when we extend it, when we look at facial recognition in Chinatown, right? I learned about, went to the city council hearing last year after I met Mutale, and there was a hearing about facial recognition and entry into buildings, right? Because landlords are doing this and there's no system. Well, in Knickerbocker Village in Chinatown, there were people on the board there, the tenant board, who were testifying that in Knickerbocker Village, the tenants years ago, the property managers had put in facial recognition biometric systems in the door, and ironically to be more safe, but in many ways for the East Asian American people and other dark skinned people, unless it didn't work correctly, unless it was in the correct light. So essentially, what people testified to is that people would get into the building who didn't belong in the building, or they couldn't get in the building if they lived in the building at times unless someone opened the door for them or a security guard. So that kind of speaks to the faulty nature. And facial recognition we see in policing, we see in housing. It's biometrics is being used in hiring and other. We're very much interested in the public advocate's office in looking at these stories and these constituents' complaints. I've seen complaints about the public libraries during COVID using facial recognition. We want to have this conversation and take in what constituents are experiencing. And facial recognition affects LGBTQ plus people, trans people, people who don't present atypical. There's a problem in that. And so we're really just essentially end here, say we're putting out across the country, we're putting out technologies that aren't really ready for this use, and again, we question whether on a privacy standpoint and other elements, but we're putting out these things fast and we're not considering the implications what are happening. And so ultimately we have to engage this issue. There has to be some type of, we need transparency. We did see the POST Act in the city council last year, which now detailing the different types of technologies the police use. It's no ban, it's no, there's no other piece. It's just letting us know. And, but again, I say, who's policing the police, or where's the oversight? And did the community get involved? And so this is why we're here, so we could have the conversation. So we talked a lot, and I thank you for your time and your patience. And I'd love to open it up. I'd love to open it up for questions. We don't have a ban in the city council right now, as in the public advocate's office is pushing that. And there is legislation that we can talk about if you have a question around Brad Hoylman's S79, which Mutale can talk about as well. So I open it up, and I thank you for your patience here.
Okay, thank you for a great presentation, all. It was very informative, and I'll hold a question I will have and call on people that want to ask questions first. I'll wait. Peter Patch first.
Yeah, I want to second and third the thank you for the presentation. And I have to say, I mean, I believe for a long time, and I may be belaboring the obvious, but that our system of justice was in many respects a system of injustice, for people of color, precisely, among other things, around the issue of false identification of an individual. The notion that it could have a 40% error rate. I mean, I like to use sort of simple examples. I mean, imagine, I ask each of us to think about this. That's not far off from a 50% error rate, which means flip a coin and you may be properly identified in a particular context, or you may be improperly identified in a particular context. And that could be used, unless it's otherwise outlawed, in a court of law to identify you to falsely identify you as a person involved in a particular incident or episode. I mean, it is absolutely horrifying. I could say that 10 times over. I will say just one other thing, which is for about 10 years, I've been involved with a nonprofit. It's actually based up in Boston, focused in part on the criminal justice system, to do some actually, really good work. But you make me so upset. I want to go down around City Hall and march around City Hall until we outlaw any use of this technology. And one last comment, which is, if it gets to 20% error rate or 10% error rate or 5% error rate, that is all totally unacceptable. I mean, even 1%, if you think of, imagine that 100,000 people, I don't know what the numbers are, but I use poetic numbers. If 100,000 people were arrested in New York City, and 1,000 of them were falsely identified and arrested based on this technology, I mean, that would be a gross injustice. And I'm sorry, one other last comment. This ends up, and this, everyone on this, in this field knows this better than I. I mean, this ends up in cases which are capital murder cases. People get wrongly identified, they get convicted, they get put in death row, and except for the Innocence Project, enough said. Thank you so much. Let's get started. We need to address this.
Thank you for your comments and your comments and your thanks, Peter. Next up is Rami, please.
Chandra, I just wanted to, I'm not going to respond every time, but just very briefly to two things that he pointed on. When we connect, I tried to connect, the light torch surveillance to contemporary times, like misidentification or purposeful misidentification or, of Black people in the South and in our policing system is also a historical context that I think was really important that Peter touched on that. And I also just wanted to make sure that the addition of what's so alarming here, right, to real is that on the government side, for instance, on the federal side, the U.S. Postal Service and their policing arm, it's come out that Congress is looking at their use. They were also using facial recognition, looking at protesters. the U.S. Postal Service. This is in the news now, and the Congress has inquiry, right? So it's a federal government agency, but that federal government agency speaks to, I mean, the data is shared in the Homeland Security. So what does that mean locally as well about our concern is that not only do we have the cameras by NYPD, but NYPD is working with a company called Gentek that is essentially connecting with private cameras across the city in a building to be able to get that data. So what you're doing is creating a massive network that's growing of surveillance and access point. And so this information is just speaking to each other, sharing data. And we have to have at a baseline, at minimal for the band, we have to also think about that we need to be thinking about how this data is getting shared and who's sharing this data. So I just wanted to add that piece and thank Peter.
You can go ahead, Ronnie.
Thank you again. Thank you guys for the presentation. I believe Council Member Mark Levine has a bill in the council. It's Intro 1760-A. It's a bill to prevent the collection of data from key fob swipes into NYCHA buildings. And I was just thinking, like, that's the same deal, right? That every time you go into your building, imagine every time you walked into your house and turned your key, the key didn't work 40% of the time. And then the other 60% of the time, someone collected that data and said, oh, your key worked. Hey, you're coming in and out at this same time every day. Oh yeah, that's good to know. So that to me is just really infuriating and just shocking that there's someone out there that knows that information about me as a person. Another thing I was thinking about a year ago, our congestion pricing task force met, and they just met last week, but I've been a little bit out of the loop with that. But one of the questions around congestion pricing, which I was talking to a board member about a year ago about, and he actually changed my mind on the issue, was that what do we do with the data that's collected from those congestion pricing cameras, you know? And are they just reading my license plate when I'm driving into the zone? Are they recognizing my face? What are they doing with that data? And that's not just about me as a private citizen. That's our taxi and livery drivers, which are technically agents or employees of the city because of their medallions, their contractors. That's all of our commercial drivers that, as we know, there's a lot in our district. So what are we doing with that data, you know? And those were just some things I was thinking about. And those are some real questions, and that just limiting facial recognition is the first step, I think. And you guys said it, but it's that other data that's being collected that as a private citizen, I don't want being collected by the government or by a private company. Because what if that company gets hacked? What if Russia decides they want to know my information? You sound paranoid, but you know, not so long ago, they were doing that with our 2016 general election. So,
I can respond to both sides. I am a computational social scientist, so Russia was absolutely collecting our data, and then Meg talked to you about how Clearview would do this, and even in the last data set that we built for 2020, many of the tweets originated in Russia. So that's absolutely something that's happening. In terms of license plate readers, there is evidence that under the last administration, that information was being shared with ICE. So one of the major ways of getting people into the deportation pipeline under our former president was through license plate readers being the first port of entry because it wasn't connected to another form of ID. Then came in another biometric process, fingerprinting. We're speaking about facial recognition, but anything that takes the term biometric means bio, body, metric, measurement. And so fingerprint reading, and then that was how they were filling detention centers. So I've given you one very discrete example in the criminal, in the context of criminal justice. But if you use self-checkout, then you are being, you're being subject to cameras that then feed into facial recognition systems. That's in case we steal toothpaste from Dwayne Reed, I guess. I never use them. Labor issues, but mostly because I don't want my data to be collected. Link NYC also takes pictures of us as we walk past, shares that data. There are cameras in subways. So it's this constant being pictured through public life. And in the case of Najir Peters, you could be a picture that someone that looks like you could be taken, and that could lead to criminalization. So the first speaker was really accurate in that analogy. But then the other part of that is it could not be you. It really couldn't be you, but because it's tagged with your name, your identity becomes criminalized when you haven't even done the act. This is definitely my jam. I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, totally. And like OMNY too, that's the same deal, right?
Yeah, the same deal. Do not, anything that says tap your wallet to get on the frigging train or on a bus, it is not worth it for the data that will be removed from your phone. Just buy a Metro card or walk or Zoom.
And the question of ultimately, I think Rami is saying it right. There's the other piece, but we have to think about, and you have to ask these questions, like the simple questions of like the data, what's it being stored, what kind of data. These are all there are ways that government and so forth.
Philip, could we get to more questions?
Sure, absolutely. But I just want to say Meg wanted to say something. So that's why I wanted to lead into Meg, make sure she
quickly. Okay.
I seen her. Yeah. I was going to ask for her to be unmuted anyway, so she could be able to respond. So I had that in my notes. So go ahead, Meg. Please.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to jump on what you're saying, Rami, because I think that it's true we need to ask careful questions about who has access to this data, but I wanted to surface two quick things from the agency perspective as well, which is that there are sometimes good and mission-driven reasons to do some data collection, but that I just don't want us to give way to hopelessness and thinking that these systems are already architected in a way that we have already lost our privacy and there's no hope, because we can actually re-architect the systems in order to accomplish important mission-driven goals like reducing climate change. A lot of the systems that are in use now are intended to make our infrastructure more efficient and useful for us, public services more useful, but we can design them in a way that is privacy by design. So it's only hanging on to that information that is useful for the purpose and getting rid of the rest so that it can't be reused or abused in the ways that we're all concerned about. Thank you, everyone. Next question.
Thank you. Next up would be Wendy, please. Unmute her.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Hi, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation, really very informative and eye-opening. I wanted to start by saying that the right to privacy is a very shaky right that we have. It's not enumerated in the Constitution. The First Amendment protects privacy of beliefs, and the Fourth Amendment protects privacy against unreasonable searches, and the Fifth Amendment protects against self-incrimination, which is implied to protect the privacy of personal information. And of course, there are many opinions, judicial opinions that have given us various rights of privacy, but they are to be guarded and protected very carefully. I wanted to also note that cross-race misidentification is a phenomenon that's been known for many, many decades, way back in the 1900s when this kind of information was being investigated. And it is not a surprise, although it is incredibly disturbing that this seeps into technology. Just to sort of build up to where I'm going, I wanted to say that I know that there are some people in high school who change their Facebook names come junior year so that whatever they have posted is not available to colleges, who also search on Facebook to look at people's profiles, and employers do as well. And, whatever you post and keep public seems to be fair game. I don't think that is necessarily an issue of privacy. There are deeper issues of social issues of discrimination and injustice that underlie all of this, because if we had a completely fair judicial system and equal access to information that was free to all people and possibly all defendants, then we would perhaps not be as worried about regulating the technology. But we don't have that. And that while we need to address the artificial intelligence issues, let's not lose sight of the very much deeper fundamental issues of injustice in our culture. I thought Rami's points were really excellent. The key fob problem, I thought when you were talking about that, Rami, also led me to believe that if somebody let in their neighbor, if you held the door open and somebody got in without swiping and later on was accused of a crime, it would be hard to then prove that you were actually in the building, because we would tend to rely on the technology rather than on witnesses who somebody might claim was lying. But just to muddle up the issue here and try to bring out various nuances, I want to tell you of a real life situation that occurred with a 16-year-old biracial boy who was attending a private school on scholarship. He was at a party with two of his best friends who were affluent white boys of privilege. And they were all at a party. And then there was another fabulous party downtown, a wonderful social life that kids lead. And they hopped into a cab together to go downtown. And at the very last minute, a girl, also from their high school class in this very posh private school, hopped in with them. And she sat on their laps, and I hope I'm not going to shock anybody. If there's anybody here who's young and is going to be shocked, this content will be a little bit sexual. She wriggled and invited them to touch her. And they all hopped out at the end. There's a lot of laughter, some of it nervous, some not. And they hopped out at the end of this ride all the way downtown at some club. And everybody was being his pre-COVID body checked, of course, for, I don't know what weapons or drugs, what are kids checked for nowadays. And they all entered the club, she on the girls' line, because she was being checked on the girls' line, and they on the boys' line. No more was thought of it. And come Monday morning, she made an accusation that she had been sexually abused. And these three boys were removed from class pretty much for the rest of the year. One of them had to drop, the biracial child had to drop Latin because he couldn't be in the class and have that same experience and the same immersion experience. The reason I'm telling you this story is that eventually he was cleared. And the way he was cleared was they were able to assemble all of the surveillance footage from all of the stores all the way down from the time that they left the first house party to the time that they went to the club, and even surveillance information in the party to show that she didn't appear to be harmed. She was laughing with friends, that it did not appear to be a traumatic situation for her. And it was very difficult to assemble this information. I think the police, according to one of the parties, the police were not necessarily, I don't want to say cooperative because I wasn't in the midst of the police mind, but they were not necessarily forthcoming. It involved lawyers and subpoenas of records. And that was actually paid for by the parents of the two affluent white boys who were also accused and who also covered the expenses of the biracial child. I'm throwing this out there because sometimes the technology can exonerate somebody who is innocent. And I think it's a really important protection to have in place. I think the country wouldn't have been as incensed if we had not seen the footage of George Floyd's murder taken by an innocent bystander. Maybe you are not considering that artificial intelligence, but it is a technological advance that certainly wasn't available 20 years ago and beyond that. And I'd like you to think about any situations where technology actually helped an innocent party, and what would it take? What means would it take? What regulations would it take in order for, because nobody's going to take down their store cameras. It's just not going to happen. These things are going to be there. There's always going to be traffic cameras. I can't imagine them taking away that revenue source from municipalities. I completely agree with Rami. What happens with the data from congestion pricing? So the data is there. We're trying to close the barn door a little bit after the horse is out. What do we do with that information? How do we use it to benefit people who are innocent? Because you're not entirely going to be able to ban the technology, and it's going to be, all technology is going to be hackable, is hackable. So how is it that we're going to balance both the phenomenon of being falsely accused of guilt, and how can we help people who are falsely accused to maintain their innocence by they're having better access to the same technology? And thanks for letting me go on for so long, and I'm eager to hear all of the responses.
I can.
I'm sorry. Hi, 1 second. Can we just have Meg? Do you mind being unmuted just in case? So when if you need to respond to anything as well, go ahead. Go ahead. You can respond. I just want to make sure the panelists are available to us. That they don't have to raise their hand or anything like that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I've actually worked on this question back in 2017. The Legal Aid Society in New York were thinking about developing apps to make sure that poor defendants or defendants that do not have close family were not being held without charge for longer than usual. And in that particular project, one of the things that we did was create what we called a closed data loop. So it's very similar to what Meg was describing in her last response, where we gathered data around arrest date, we gathered data around charging. We did not allow that data to be shared. And then once the person was seen and we felt, and it was felt that they were moving through the judicial system, that data was destroyed. That was an amazing pilot. The problem is there is no current business model for closed data sets, because the reason that we rely on what we call data fog, which is all the other things, people assume that artificial intelligence systems are using discrete data sets, but often they're making inferences from the things around. So if we think back to Cambridge Analytica, where they were trying to profile the Trump voter, the way that they built that initial data set was through asking people what cats they liked and what they like to do on Saturdays and what they like to do on Sundays, and then use those inferences to develop to target. So that's kind of number one. Number two, in terms of this idea that it could be used to exonerate, I am still working with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke's office on federal legislation. We introduced no biometric barriers in 2019, and we're looking at a reintroduction. So we have a Senate partner. We're looking at Black women in the Congressional Black Caucus, and we're developing a strategy right now. One of the things that she brought up, because there was a case 2 years ago where police killed a Black man with disabilities in her district. And the cameras around, when they looked at the cameras, it was very obvious that he was going through some type of mental episode. So the question that we're asking of the city right now is, instead of using these cameras to catch bad guys, what if we use these cameras to look at when people were vulnerable? Or what if we use these cameras, didn't take personal identification data, but to understand the plight of the unhoused, and then use that data to fix social problems? So thank you for that question, because it's certainly something the AI for the People think about a lot of the time, because we don't want you to just think that it's over. Right? We have agency. This could be used for social justice ends, but we have to make that demand.
Thank you both. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Mutale, for pointing out this example of in your first remarks, data minimization, and in the second case, ways that these technologies could be used to exonerate. I just want to respond, Wendy, to your point by saying that for me, there's an important distinction between the use of cameras and the use of facial recognition. And facial recognition can be applied to any camera footage, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So in a scenario where there is existing camera footage, after some crime, we can go back to a specific place, a specific time, and check that for exonerating evidence. But at least in my mind, that is a different scenario than facial recognition technology, which in an ex-ante way is identifying people proactively, and it could be misidentifying people. It could be generating all of this information. In my field, we call it datafication. This is introducing new inferences that could absolutely go wrong. And to deepen this, point that you raised, I would refer us all to the example of body cam footage that police warned body cam video raises all of these same questions of, can it be used as a tool for accountability and transparency? Can it be used as a tool for surveillance? And I would say that the different data governance measures that have been put in place to try to strike the right balance for police-worn body cam footage is another example that we can turn to when we try to think about what kinds of policies need to be in place so that we do this right, so that we can get the good without as much of the bad.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up would be Rebecca, please.
Hi, first, I just want to say thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Sandrea, so much for holding this meeting. This is a little bit of an obsession of mine. And before I make my comments, I just want to mention that the bill that was mentioned did pass. And it's not just for NYCHA, it's for all landlords with the key fob. So that's exciting. And I think this is just, as we've seen from the discussion, just like opening the doors. So I hope we hold future meetings about other issues such as like reverse search warrant bans, ownership of data, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for this one, I'm just wondering if the speakers would like us to produce a resolution or how they would like us to, use the information they gave us here tonight.
Yes, produce a resolution.
Yeah, I think Mitali was pretty direct there. And I think, one, thank you for that question and your proactive inquiry here. Yes, if this committee can continue to do the work that you all have been doing by bringing this issue to the main board, thinking and crafting a resolution, we would love it. We think it's important. Again, we're being reactive here, right? These things have moved pretty fast, and that's why we're having to have these critical conversations, but these technologies moved and these implementations of them happened way before, right? And so that would be great. And you all have your elected. So you have your local electeds, your city, have some critical conversations. Why are they not focusing on this issue? I know you have to think about too, is that we have an election coming up. I can't be political, but what I can acknowledge is that there's going to be a new city council, a new mayor, right? So, what's going on there, whether it's your elected or if you have friends in other districts on other community boards, we're going to be talking to other community boards here. Maybe you can team up and do some work here. Lastly, and I would also say, bring this to your friends and family. Like this is a moment. And there's also the state legislation. You can look at the state legislation by Brad Hoylman that Mitali can speak to, S79. And lastly, there is a resource. There is a documentary film. Mitali created a great film, but there also is there's Coded Bias on Netflix. If you have access to Netflix, that you can watch that film and share it with people, right? So there is the resolution, talking to your electeds and sharing this information, because I lastly end to Rebecca's point, this is an entry point to these ways that technology is impacting our lives and our outcomes. And the Public Advocate's Office wants to continue to have these conversations.
Yeah, and just to add on that not only is it an entry point, but it's also just like the tip of the iceberg when it comes to government's involvement and actually, I don't want to say profiting, but contributing to the lack of privacy we have today. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me call on Erica, please. I don't want to, is it Erica? Yes, I don't want to leave her out. She had a hand up.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for this comprehensive look at AI and biometrics. I work in healthcare and I have for 25 years. And personally, I've never been under any illusions that my healthcare information is private. I share it to the degree that I need to for my convenience, but we don't even own our healthcare data, which is humongous business. So while they say it's aggregated, it is to a certain degree, but it takes about 60 seconds to re-identify the 18 points of protected health information. So that's one. Two, I've been involved with the Manhattan judicial system now going on about a year and a half with an organization called Court Watch New York City, which is part of the Brooklyn Bail Fund Services, I believe. Their mission has recently changed. And what I've learned about this topic is that, so while we're in public, there is a reasonable, what's the word I'm looking for? They can reasonably video us, track us, because we're public, we're in technically a large group of people. However, if you want to look at it from a personal perspective, if you see something happening to somebody who's incarcerated in a courthouse, your first reaction is to want to publish that information. But what people forget is that the person who the act is being perpetrated against also has rights to privacy, just because it's happening in a public space in a courthouse. Because I've seen people handcuffed being abused by the police in the down on Center Street in the courthouse. But my last comment, and to me, I do feel like this is a bit out of the gate. Having lived in Europe, I know what it can look like, because Europe protects people's privacy way more. But the difference is Europe also doesn't have something called Citizens United. Their countries don't have it. The EU doesn't have it. They don't have this artificial, ridiculous law that says corporations are protected by the First Amendment. So they also don't have lobbying to the degree that we do. So I applaud everybody who's working in this space, because for me, that horse is out of the barn. And unless you move to like the backwoods of Alaska and shut down all your internet access, this is a pretty intense uphill climb. I mean, I'm not saying, I mean, it has to be done, but the fact that the US seems to think that everything about us should be for sale is just plain wrong. Or that we shouldn't be the ones individually that benefit and get to choose who we sell it to.
I'd like to respond. Thank you, Erica, very much for these comments. And I'd like to, amplify what Erica is saying, that even when data is shared in an anonymized form, it's true that it can be easily re-identified, and that does pose a huge privacy problem. And Erica's comments point us towards this public sector, private sector distinction that we've been talking about a few times tonight. And I would like to say that even though it does feel like in some ways the horse is out of the barn with respect to privacy and private sector use of that information, like stuff we've told to Google, stuff we've told to Amazon, I would argue that there is this extremely important distinction with what the government does with our information, because the government has the only lawful monopoly on the use of force. So when we're talking about what information the government has about us and any identifications that they make or misidentifications that they make, they can show up armed like they did to DREC in that video and cause physical harm under the law. And so making sure that the government gets this right, to me, as a researcher, is an achievable goal, especially when it comes to making sure that they're not misusing facial recognition and datafied technologies. That's all I wanted to say about that. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think this is another distinction where we look at people that pursue rights versus people that pursue justice, right? So AI for the People is a racial justice organization, and under justice frameworks, we actually do not believe the laws that we have necessarily serve us. And so we are always looking to reimagine, reappropriate, and recreate worlds that serve everybody. If you think about even if you think about the phrase Black Lives Matter, they actually never have in this country. So the fact that that was even proclaimed is extremely aspirational. And so I would say three things. First of all, healthcare data, if folks do not know who Latanya Sweeney is at Harvard Kennedy School, they should do that. She anomalized healthcare data and identified the governor of Massachusetts, which I thought was really interesting, having spent some time in Cambridge, a college up there. That just made me really happy that came out of Harvard. I think the second thing, and this is where folks like me get really excited, is that we do have international models. We have the GDPR, for example, which is a European law that looks at privacy, but we also have the Privacy Protection Act in Illinois, which is so strong that Clearview, which is a company we've talked about a couple of times, were forced to pull out their data sets of Illinois. So this is happening in this country. We have similar in California. Yeah. And so there is kind of light there. And then this is slightly off the topic, and I feel like we've gone long, but I do feel that there's a misinterpretation of the First Amendment, specifically around the speech on social media, because the First Amendment is about protecting our right to criticize government. It does not give anybody the right to take our information in public spaces and weaponize it. And I wrote about this in, oh gosh, what was the name? These journals, boy, they're so long. Harvard Kennedy School African American Policy Review, where I did talk about that this is not protected. But because Silicon Valley have bigger money, more marketing, and to the point that you made about Citizens United, they're creating this type of power asymmetry based on not only the personification of companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., are all companies, but just this idea that they're too big. And one thing I always say is when you don't have money, organized people are always going to win out money any day. And so we have to organize around this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Andrew, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for such a great forum this evening. This has been so educating and fascinating. And I'm so thrilled that you brought up Illinois and California, because one of my questions, I'm so happy you mentioned the bill with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and I'd love to know who that Senate sponsor is. But as we've seen with voting rights, or really voting restrictions, state legislatures have tremendous impact on our everyday life. And so this year, I'm trying to think more like a bad guy and jigger those systems to use it for good. So what can we do with regards to state legislatures? And if state legislatures don't want to act, what can we do to get initiatives on the ballot? As we saw with healthcare Medicaid expansion, for example, there have been many, many states, such as Maine, such as Utah, such as Missouri, where the state officials didn't want to implement those measures and voters overwhelmingly overruled those elected officials. We've seen that with the legalization of marijuana in certain states. We've seen it with taxing the rich for education in Arizona. What can we do with regards to state legislatures and then also ballot initiatives to give people direct power regarding their data?
Meg, do you want to go? I have some ideas, but I've jumped in a couple of times.
Oh, I think after you, Mutale.
Okay. So yes, we have to have a dual strategy, right? So we definitely need a state level ground game. And we are AI for the People, I should say, and some folks that we work with really closely are looking at some of the measures like S79, which we don't love, actually. And the reason we don't love it is that while it bans police use of biometric technologies, the next clause in that is that there would be a commission set up, and then there is the opportunity to sunset. So it's more of a moratorium. And I think one of the things in a post-George Floyd world is that we've expanded our idea of what's even possible. And so one of the things we've been doing over the last few months is speaking to ACLUs across the country to find out why they use this. And I sit on a commission actually in Massachusetts, which passed a law very much like S79. And I'm on that commission alongside manufacturers of facial recognition technology, as well as like the FBI and the CIA, who are just like, yeah, more technology. And so I think even the ACLU are beginning to realize that in their state level strategies that we can be and we should be more aggressive. So I think that's the first thing. However, having said that, S79 is live. We do speak to Homeland's office often about this, and we have made our opinions known. Session is about to end, so I don't know that that's going to go anywhere, but that presents the opportunity that you're actually talking about, which is to develop a better bill using that as the basis. I think the second point that you made around amendments is we have to expand beyond facial recognition and start thinking about the classes of technology. So not just the biometrics, gait, iris scanners, but license plate readers, ShotSpotter technology, which is being extended in high crime areas, geofencing. So many people think that the way we got people at the Capitol on June 6th is through biometrics. That's not actually true. The police got them through geolocation data. How do I know that sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn? Because of the no-fly lists that were generated. Biometric data is not going to give you a license plate and your name and your address, right? There has to be further investigation. So even that is extremely problematic. And a lot of the artwork that we're doing and a lot of the TV work and a lot of the public education is meant to really increase that. We actually have a huge kind of Juneteenth celebration in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, where we're going to be speaking about these issues. And we've managed to get TV stations to come as well as other big papers. I hate to jinx press, but that will be out there. We're in communication with Sarah. She has all the details if you need that. But the reason that we're starting to go block by block, community by community, is that we have to get folks engaged. We have to let them know what the problem is and then let them know that they can also be the solution. And then the final thing I'll say on the federal level is Ed Markey is our Senate sponsor. I've been working with that office for 5 years, and what they're doing algorithmic accountability is inserting this language around impact assessment. So if we were to pass this bill, then just like we don't release medicines into our community without some type of testing period, we're proposing not to release technologies, and that would include not just biometrics, but DNA technology and a lot of these junk science technologies that don't actually work. And that would slow things down. And so we would really be leaning on our friends in the policy community to help us identify disparate impact.
I just want to piggyback by saying that Mutale and Sarah are both incredible resources to get in touch with if you want to be part of the legislative push in this vein. And
yes, I think please.
They're amazing, and leading a coalition of organizations that are all involved across the state. I would say that, and the country, Mutale speaks to that national perspective. As a researcher, I would say that the ways that different jurisdictions are responding give us this amazing natural laboratory to try to figure out how to get this right. And when you look at the GDPR from across the pond, we see that, giving people personal responsibility over all of these decisions isn't necessarily the best option either. I mean, who really likes clicking accept all cookies every time that they go to a website now? And how far does that really get us? So as we look to California, we look to our own legislature, we want to be really thoughtful about what is working and to experiment still. I don't think that there's consensus on what the substance of a bill should look like aside from what Mutale has shared and the idea that a ban is important for certain classes of technology.
And then the one thing I would say is we are activating a partnership to help New Yorkers think about this and imagine this around June 19th. And we're going to be partnering with the Public Theatre, where we've commissioned a set of posters with a civic organization called Four Freedoms. And one of our posters will be projected on Joe's Pub for the whole month of June. And that's designed to not only get press, but get people to even start thinking about this. If they could just ask, what is that? That becomes the entry point to conversation and community.
That is so great. I'm so happy that the Public Theatre is getting involved.
Yeah, New York is back. Do not let people tell you New York is not back.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a quick, simple question, and then Sarah, my co-chair, she'll jump in and she has a question as well, and then we'll work on the resolution. In the ban the scan video, the gentleman that was in there when he was talking about the knocking on his door, was that the same young man? I guess they would have to be unmuted if everybody's muted. Was that the same young man that was on social media, and a lot of people I think it was in like the Turtle Bay area, Manhattan, and a lot of people were down, protesters like myself. I didn't go down, but we all were aware of what was going on to help support him. Was that the same gentleman? Could someone answer that?
Yeah, that was Derek Ingram.
Yes,
and
okay.
He's a baby. He's like 20.
Right, yeah. Yeah, because I lead a vigil at Carl Schurz Park. It's actually today is our 358th day since June 2nd. So, and, all information, we sent support down there and for Black Lives Matter. So we sent the support, and we're actually out there again, of course, tomorrow, because we've been out there since June 2nd. But, anything going on with comrades, we all, we respond, so I just wanted to make sure, because it seemed like that was part of the story. Okay, that's good. You wanted to say something, Meg? Okay.
Oh, yeah, if you would like to find Derek Ingram on the internet, his organization is called Warriors in the Garden. It's on Instagram and Twitter, Warriors in the Garden. Yeah.
Yeah, we did some work. So yeah.
Well, not just you, but just amplifying to signal boost the incredible work that they're doing.
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah.
And one thing I'll say, Sandrea, which I really appreciate, is my role isn't in the street. I will analyze, I will speak to policymakers, we will create art, we will convince cultural institutions to get involved. And I have so much love, respect, and appreciation for people that put their bodies on the line, because if it wasn't for people putting their bodies on the line, we would be in chains. So I just want to say that I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a long haul. We'll be in a year, June 2nd, every day. Go ahead, Sarah. Thank you for responding, both of you.
Sarah. And Mutala, you make an amazing point, and in recognizing the work that Sandrea does every single day, and the communities that she organizes, and the breadth of that work that she does. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so in terms of our resolution, I'm hearing that we want these technologies to be regulated. We want a role for the community, and because that's where our values are. And we also want to use Mutale's words, reimagine, reappropriate, recreate, and reimagine. Okay. How we use technology. And so in thinking about how to form a resolution, I wanted to make sure that it was formed in a way that policymakers didn't say, oh, we already did that, because New York City has had a previous task force that was broadly panned for basically being a show, and didn't generate the work product or the information and the data that was intended for the work of that task force. And so can you help us with an approach that would give us language that would call for what we want and avoid policymakers who might say, oh, we already did that, that's done? or you already got the post-act that's done?
So again, going back to the difference between justice and rights, many of us in justice spaces do not feel that the post-act met any of our goals. And part of the reason is what Meg said, generating more data that then puts the burden on us to analyze the data and decide whether the data is correct. And then also asking, in this case, the NYPD to be honest about how they're using technology. We just didn't have enough trust in the institution to do that. So I think from an AI for the people perspective, what we would do, and it was mentioned earlier brilliantly by our colleague that brought up the incident in the taxi. I actually really appreciated that she told that story, because stories move people, number one. But one of the things we're looking at is what Meg has been talking about, which is how do we create resolutions that start with, we have these technologies. They are part of our lives. We are technical citizens, but we demand that use of that technology does not undermine our human or civil rights. And within the language, talk about what you want the technology to do, as opposed to just not talking about what you don't want it to do. Because I think what happened with the previous task force was, and this is my 30,000-foot view of this, they were so concerned with this is bad, you know, get off my lawn, that they became really difficult to hear. Whereas I think if policymakers are presented with something positive, and there is data behind this, it's much easier. The other thing is speak through the language of their constituents. Coded Bias is an exceptional documentary. The reason that it doesn't necessarily hit with policymakers that we work with is that they want to know what's going on in New York. And that 5-minute clip where you have someone going into an apartment building, which is completely believable. And then you have the Derek Ingram story, which is at this stage an international news story, right? Because it wasn't just the police that were outside. To Sandrea's point, people were resisting. I think are two potential strategies that I think could be really, really compelling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'll add to that another thing that went wrong with the Automated Decision Systems Task Force was it really depended on a lot of transparency from each of the agencies. And we know that some of the agencies are a lot more forthcoming than others, and that getting access to information is difficult. So under a transparency frame where you want disclosure, like Mutale is saying, that presents, that makes it into an information problem. But if you're turning around to agencies and coming up with an operational definition of this is what the technologies of concern are, and you can't use them, that changes the dynamic so much versus what we've previously seen in terms of an approach that puts the agencies into a need to respond rather than making a decision about whether to disclose.
And I just have
Meg.
What?
Brilliant, Meg. Just saying.
I'm learning from you about the distinctions here.
Would you like us to reference Brad Hoylman's bill, or not specify any legislation?
I think Hoylman's bill is so important because Hoylman is bold in his legislative ambitions, whether we're talking about walking while trans or whether we're talking about extending the time for survivors. And I think it's a really important first step. That bill was written by NYCLU, New York Civil Liberties Union, who we work with really, really closely. And the thing that I love about that particular partnership is they are evolving, and they were writing it under the lens of transparency and privacy, whereas the work we're doing with them is to reorientate towards civil rights and justice. And when you think about civil rights and justice, you can then invoke Section 7 of the Civil Rights Act, where we have protected classes. It is actually illegal to discriminate against people on the grounds of race. Thankfully, thanks to the 1968 Civil Rights act. The problem is facial recognition does that. And we have seen some legal challenges at the federal level. For example, the Department of Housing under the Trump administration sued Facebook because their ad buying allowed people to check off the type of person they wanted to see their ad. And in this case, we're speaking about often racial proxies. So you definitely want in the language, not just that you want something that doesn't express bias in accordance to civil rights legislation, but acknowledges that zip code is a proxy for race because we live with the legacy of redlining. And redlining means Black folks are more likely to live in jacked up neighborhoods. And that's the same of New York than anywhere else. Educational attainment becomes a proxy because who gets to have an elite education? People with means, they're more likely. So I think as long as you can, if you could start to use that type of language, it also allows a certain level of sophistication. And Homan's office are all the way in. They're so, they're very open to critique, and I think they just want to get it right.
Yeah, because I've read the bill before, and I agree the focus is much more on privacy and the ethical implications of the technology in the first place, and not as much on how it affects different communities in a different way.
Yeah, we think leaning on that existing federal legislation is a worthy approach because there is so much energy around this idea that Black Lives Matter. Well, this truth, let me not say idea. The truth is Black Lives Matter.
Mutale, what is the name of the federal legislation?
So it went in Algorithmic Accountability Act. And if you look, 116th Congress, and it was introduced by Clark and Ayanna Pressley. And there is going to be a reintroduction. And there was a question about what ordinances should we think about. Having impact assessment and algorithms is a really good ordinance on the state level.
Okay. So I'm not so quick on the drafting tonight, but I thought that the way that we could construct a resolution, we would start with whereas we are immersed in a technology-infused society, and then that whereas could talk about the different ways in which we intersect with technology. And whereas S79, the Senate bill in New York State, and the Algorithmic Accountability Act are important starts to generate, raise our concerns, the needs for equity in the algorithms that are used. And then the resolved would be, we call on our city and state legislators to take action to regulate algorithmic and AI technologies such that we reimagine, reappropriate, and recreate how we use technology, that technologies are examined for potential biases and disparities that they may create, and this can be operationalized through the development of impact assessments for all algorithms before they are implemented.
Yes.
And then I need more help.
I would personally add that while that impact assessment is so important for the broad class of, automated decision systems, that for facial recognition and other biometric systems, that there there should be a ban on facial recognition systems, in my opinion. And I don't know if this body would feel comfortable signing on to that call, but I think that is in line with the evidence.
And I would put that in line with field testing, because another thing about the way technology is deployed is that, so what brought me into this work was working with Google and looking at their product design and thinking about releasing minimum viable products. So I was at Google at the time that there was the big controversy around Google Images. And the way that was brought to us was if you typed in Black teenager, a bunch of mugshots came up, and that was because of labeling protocols within the company. And then if you typed in Black couple, the pictures of gorillas came up, like Black people were being labeled as gorillas. And the reason that's really relevant to this particular this particular idea around banning is if there could be language. I personally would like to see, in cases where technologies violate the terms of the 1968 Federal Rights Act, Section 7, those technologies should be banned. And that really that puts nearly every biometric. That makes you look at DNA, that makes you look at facial recognition, it makes you look at gait recognition, iris, all of that. But it doesn't allow you to look at license plate readers, but then maybe the disparate impact. And another thing I would talk about is the afterlife of that technology. So it's not just the data, but it's how is that data used and by how many parties. So getting back to this idea of closed circuit technology, not just letting our data be used by any old third party intermediary. I can also email you, Sarah.
Okay.
Right.
Sorry, can we recognize Rita, please? She had a hand up, if it's okay. And then you can go ahead after her, Philip.
No
Thank you. This was fabulous. It was just fabulous. But Sarah, don't we want to have something about checks and balances in this? It scares me to death. It just does, but somewhere in there, I think we have to have the words checks and balances. It's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Philip.
No, and I was just thinking, and again, clearly we're calling for a ban, as Meg was saying, and what we're seeing across the country and how that moves forward. The city council. And Muchali brought up the important point around these closed networks, right? The issue of the sharing of data, who's sharing data, the afterlife of data. But also I've been in conversation with Meg, and even in Boston, the Boston New Urban Mechanics mayor's office, there are also, I don't know if it can be in the resolution, but thinking about that last piece of the afterlife, but also like the type of vendors the city is purchasing from. There are going to be vendors. I do think there will be a market for vendors and companies. For instance, in Boston, they piloted and tested with a vendor that was capturing license plate readers or doing things, but the way that they did it, they were still able to manage certain privacy protections or certain. So there's a way to include, when we think about reimagining, recreating. Well, what are also investigating what kind of vendors and companies that you're purchasing from and the functionality that they're able to think. So I think keeping that in mind maybe is something.
Rita, your hand is up again, or
no? It didn't come down.
Okay, no problem. Didn't want to not recognize you.
Okay. I'm very sorry for all the people who are waiting on my very slow composition. Usually we do this through a Google Doc that we can share. but I'm using a different computer for my Zoom than I am typing all my notes. We do need to get language here so we can have a resolution. Mutale, can you help me again with the 1968? What was the name of the bill called?
Let me make sure that I told you the right, but it's Section 7 of the Civil Rights Act, where they talk about protected classes. Let me get it. And this is actually now being widely accepted on the federal level.
Okay.
Yeah, Civil Rights Act of 1968, Section 7.
Civil Rights Act of 1968. Okay. Okay. So, establish. Okay, so in the whereases, we'll talk about technologies that exist. We would talk about S79 and the Algorithmic Accountability Act as important starts to
Sarah, I got it wrong. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title 7.
Title 7.
Yeah. And that's, I got that from the EEOC website. So it's talking about equal protections, basically equal employment. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Whereas the S79 and Federal Algorithmic Accountability Act raised the need for equity and raise the need for algorithmic justice and are an important start. And then resolved, we call on our city and state legislators to regulate algorithmic and AI technology such that we reimagine, reappropriate, recreate how we use technology in our city and state government, implement community-based regulation as checks and balances to ensure that the technology we interact with are functioning in accordance with our values, practice the examination of algorithms for bias operationalized through impact assessments prior to implementation, ban technologies that exacerbate disparities among disparities enumerated, disparities for the
members of protected classes, and then reference that 1964 Act, Section 7.
Thank you. Ban technologies that exacerbate disparities for members of protected classes as delineated in Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as ban biometric surveillance technologies such as facial recognition, gait recognition, etc. Regulate the afterlife of technology such that data that is collected is secured when in use and destroyed after use, and any collection is limited only to the function, and then establish ground rules for how vendors and companies can participate in city and state government in a manner that meets the values that meets these values.
Yeah. Something about these values that we hold dear. They like that. I write that in every single. Thanks to Hamilton.
Yes. Principles. Okay.
I'd also like to, well, I see that Wendy has raised her hand, but I'd quickly like to invite the body to clarify whether you'd like the ban on facial recognition biometric surveillance for the government use or for both government and private sector use, as Portland has done and other jurisdictions are considering.
Ban it all.
I would agree with saying that it shouldn't be used.
Ring doorbells will kill you, man.
Ring doorbells. Yeah, they are. Wendy has her hand up, and if folks feel
that might be a different discussion though, but it's worth considering.
Mm-hmm. How folks feel about including the private sector in this, and you're unusually quiet tonight. Oh, I got a thumbs up from Rebecca.
Yeah, thumbs been going up before too a few times.
Oh, they have been? Okay, I just didn't see. Okay.
So some thumbs up if you're for it, thumbs up, virtual, and yeah. Okay, this is a great consensus.
I'm giving a verbal thumbs up. This is Wendy. I'm giving a verbal thumbs up for including commercial.
Because your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for unmuting me. I was going to jump in and say commercial considerations are important. They overlap, but are not exactly the same as the governmental and policing implications. And I think that if people are going to have their information potentially sold, that they are entitled to receive economic benefit from that sale. It's my information. I generated it. I create it every day. If somebody's gonna make a profit, I get to participate. So I'd love to see that in there. I think that would help all people of every race. But the other thing is I definitely wanted to include biometrics in there. I think, Sarah, when you were drafting, you mentioned facial recognition, et cetera, but I definitely want to make sure that biometrics is articulated because that's incredibly chilling. And Sarah, in the first two whereases, can you just read those again? The first two whereases?
I still need to fill those in. But the topics of the first two whereases, the first one would be, whereas we're immersed in a technology-infused, we live in a technology-infused society, and then maybe some statement about, technology, we interact with technology in multiple facets every day. Then the second whereas would name S79 and the Federal Algorithmic Accountability Act.
In between the first and the proposed second, can we insert another whereas to recognize that this technology, which includes but is not limited to AI and biometrics, is used in discriminatory practices against people of color? That's what we're really talking about. This is like the essential crux of why we have a resolution. So we need to have that statement in there right up top to say why we're talking about this. In my opinion, everybody can ignore me. I don't mean to sound bossy. I'm just saying, in my passion, that's what I would like. We've got the technology, and here's the problem.
Yeah.
Which again does extend across in excess beyond people of color as well, right? Again, people who don't present atypical and mutilate women, older people. There's a number
people with disabilities. Absolutely, Philip, completely right.
Okay.
And is inaccurate. I think that's another whereas, and whereas this technology has been shown to be inaccurate in up to 40% or at least 40% of criminal situations or whatever, however particular you can be, however much you can drill down into that.
And then I think after that whereas, we should include a whereas about, and even if these technologies become more accurate, that the disparities they create in the violations of our civil right are that their accuracy does remedy those violations.
And they violate human rights convention. That's where the language of disparate impact, I think, is really valuable, because the issue that we have with civil rights law in this country is that you have to show that you are intentionally discriminating on race. So the white only drinking fountain being like the largest example of that. But if we're speaking about proxies, if we're speaking about zip code becoming a proxy, education becoming a proxy, then that's not intentional. We have to go to the human rights literature and go to disparate impact. I would also talk about the power asymmetry between the companies that sell technologies and the governments that procure. Because often what's happened in a procurement relationship is that I, Clearview AI, develop a technology, I tell you how to use it, I service the technology, and you, the housing authority, are completely dependent on me to make sure that that quote unquote works. I don't know if it's going to make it into the resolution, but there is, who's the government here? Is it Clearview AI or is it New York City?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's important for the vendor component.
Yeah.
That resolved that the city and state should be establishing regulations and develop and
redress this power imbalance.
That there's an imbalance in the procurement and
in procurement processes.
In procurement processes
that blur the lines of government, that blur the lines of government and put power in private sector oblique organizations who are not accountable, who are not safekeepers of the public good.
Mm-hmm.
That's the issue. Mark Zuckerberg couldn't care less about me and you, but is controlling, the thoughts of more people than Jesus.
Also, before I call on Rebecca, is there room, I don't know if it was hit or not, for the call on for accountability when the data is misused? Was there anything we discussed there? So call on some accountability when the data is misused for what it has been intended to be used for. So if they're using data from us going in and out of our apartments with the key fobs or something like that, and criminalizing people, right? So which I know law enforcement can do. And Rebecca's unmuted too. I think she wants to jump in.
Yeah, and Wendy, feel free to correct me if I was wrong, but I thought I heard you say you wanted something included about, when companies are profiting off of our data. I'm assuming you were referring to like not biometric data. And I think that's such a complicated issue. I think last time I checked, like 7 different bills in the state Senate and Assembly trying to tackle that issue. And I think we should explore it further. But if we include it at all, maybe it can be a little bit more vague so it doesn't kind of take away from the major call about this one specific area, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Both are huge issues, I think, for the future to really take a look at, right? That's why I said it's an entry point, both the data commodification of data ownership, but also to Sandrea's point, the redress of harm. That is like what you'll, as you engage and learn more about tech, how do we find out when it's been misused or had a bad outcome, given us a bad outcome? What's the opportunities to redress it, the mechanism to redress it? That's, I think, a future thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So ultimately, we will have a finalized version of this resolution ready for our community board meeting. And in the past, we've been able to kind of outline the broad points that we're going to be making, and then kind of beautifying the resolution later. But we do need to agree on the whereases. We need to agree on the resolved. And so, should I go back through the resolves? So we're going to try to stick with this language as much as possible, but with the understanding that we'll need to tinker with it as we're finalizing it, but that we're sticking with these calls on our government. So,
sorry, can Rita jump in? I think she has her hand up again.
Oh, sorry, Rita. Yes.
No, that's okay.
At a certain point, we really have to vote, because you have to show that to the full board that we voted. Do you think, I know that you're wordsmithing and it's very hard to do it sitting and talking to everybody. Do you think that we could summarize it so that we could verbally and just vote on it? And then it's just a suggestion.
Yes. So with the committee's approval, that you would trust. Actually, what we can do is draft it and then circulate it to the committee to make sure that we got on paper everything that we talked about in this discussion. So broadly, the resolves are: we call on our city and state legislators to take action to regulate algorithmic and AI technologies such that we reimagine, reappropriate, recreate how we use technology in our city and state government, implement community-based regulation as the check and balance to ensure that technology we interact with are functioning in accordance with our values, implement a practice of examining algorithms for bias operationalized through impact assessments prior to implementation, ban technologies that exacerbate disparities for members of protected classes, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as a ban on biometric surveillance technologies. So Wendy, that's the biometrics part that you wanted to make sure we got in. Regulate the afterlife of technology such that the data that is collected is minimized and secured when in use and destroyed after use. Establish regulations and principles that vendors and companies must follow, so we can vigilantly guard the commercialization. Establish regulations and principles that vendors and companies have to follow, the values that we hold dear, and then integrated into that is vigilantly guard the commercialization of our personal data. And then establishing mechanisms to redress harm when data is misused, or inappropriately released or something.
It's misused.
Misused. Okay. So, my friends, do we have a second for such a? I've got a thumbs up. The first one from Rebecca. I also saw Rita's hand go up. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
And then Max, can you help us with the vote, please?
Sure. For those that want to abstain or not vote for cause, please raise your hand. Okay, seeing none, this passes unanimously. I just have to read everyone's name. That's here. We have Rita, Sarah, Sondrea, Peter Patch, Olita, May, Taco, Rebecca, and that's it. Yep.
Great.
You called Wendy, right? You called Wendy?
No. I may not have. Wendy as well.
Fantastic. I'm not sure if you did. Okay.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, committee members, we will circulate the draft of this resolution to make sure that we're all in agreement about the finalized language, because we approved it in concept right now. And we will be, this resolution will come before the full board in June something, Max?
I wish I had it off the top of my head, but very soon. I can look right now.
And so what we can do is in the minutes, we can refer people to coded bias. We can refer people to Ban the Scan and the 60 Minutes episode on facial recognition. And we welcome our speakers here today. If you would like to present in our public session, that would be a way to speak to the entire board before we get to our specific item.
And June 16th, I just saw.
June 16th. So wonderful. Oh, Rita?
Okay.
The presentation has to be 2 minutes.
Yes.
Remember, in the public session. So whatever they present has to be very succinct.
And you can pull your time if you're in a group as well.
Right.
So great. So I cannot thank you enough, Mutale, Meg, Philip. We really had the opportunity to have the all-stars of technology equity here in our committee tonight. And I'm just so grateful. Sandra and I have been talking about this issue, and this is an amazing meeting. Thank you everyone so much for hanging in there for my very slow drafting, and we're so fortunate to have had all of us together in the same room together, or online together, to discuss this topic. So many, many thanks to everybody. And just Andrea, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, well, once again, thank you for presenting. This was phenomenal. We received a lot of information. It's great that it's recorded on YouTube so we can share it with other people that did not attend the meeting, especially, hopefully, Max, you can get it out to some of the members before we go to the full board, right? So they can they know it's here, but it was just really great. And yes, so appreciative. And we crafted a reso. And thank you again, Sarah. She's on the keyboards. Amazing. So before we close, I guess, do we have any old business? Any new business? I will add that tomorrow is, of course, as everyone knows, the anniversary, sadly, of George Floyd, his death. It's 1 year anniversary. And as a UES for BLM organizer, we are out there tomorrow night at Carl Schutz Park. So consecutively, but we will be out there for the vigil. And I know there's other spaces and places. So feel free to come to us or to go somewhere else, or just reflect upon the family on tomorrow, because it's rough. It's rough. With that said, any motions to adjourn the meeting?
Oh, I see Rebecca.
Great. I'll second.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Good night.
Can I just say really quickly, because I didn't want this to get in, it's also a year since the Central Park birdwatching incident. Mm-hmm. They happened on the same day.
Okay. Yeah.
That's right.
All right. Yes. Yeah. I'm always going to remember the day. It's my father's birthday. So
let's keep it at that.
He's gone though. He's gone, but it's always going to be a day I'm always going to remember. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you all for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Matt. Well,
thanks, Phil.
Always.
Else, everyone may Good night, good night, good night.